Welcome back. Last time we discussed why Muslims translated pre-Islamic civilizations' philosophical and scientific texts into Arabic, preparing the ground for the rise of the Masha'i school. This time we'll discuss its leading figures. The first great figure was al-Kindi, an Arab from the cosmopolitan city of Basra, where his father was governor. He received the best education possible. He was very pious, always concerned with Islamic themes, such as the question of divine unity, and he even became the tutor for the son of the caliph. He was a major intellectual figure in Baghdad in the middle of the 3rd Islamic century. His stature was such that he came to be considered in the Middle Ages in France as one of the 12 greatest geniuses of humanity, and as a sign of the esteem in which he was held, his image is carved on some cathedrals of the time. As the first person to write on Islamic philosophy in Arabic, he is acknowledged as the founder of Islamic philosophy. It is he who made the famous statement we quoted previously, that Islam requires a Muslim to seek truth no matter where it might be. On the basis of that, he read these philosophical texts we discussed, and he tried to create a relationship, a harmony between reason and revelation, between religion and philosophy. He was the first to have written about this subject. If this were a more advanced course on Islamic philosophy, I would go into detail about what his solution was, but I really cannot do that in this class. But I want you to remember that this question of the relationship between faith and reason, which is part and parcel of 2,000 years of Western history, was tackled philosophically for the first time by al-Kindi, even before it was discussed in the West as far as Aristotelian philosophy is concerned. And this is because the West of St. Augustine didn't have access to Aristotle. Early Christian thought was concerned with certain strands of Platonism, but the rational philosophical thought of Aristotle didn't play a role in the West until the 11th, 12th centuries. As for Jewish thought, there's only one Jewish philosopher before al-Kindi, and that is Philo, who wrote in Greek, not Hebrew, and who was interested in Plato and not Aristotle. So the founder of a philosophy which was later to become common between Judaism and Christianity and Islam, and whose central thesis was the relationship between faith and reason, the problem between faith and reason, is al-Kindi. He's a very important figure for that reason. At the same time, he was a scientist. He wrote on chemistry, metallurgy, and so forth. This is one of the elements that characterizes all of the Islamic peripatetic philosophers. They were also scientists or philosopher scientists. And finally, al-Kindi wrote a book on the theory of music, which you might say is number in time, as geometry is number in space, from a Pythagorean Platonic point of view, which is extremely significant for reasons that we shall discuss in our section on Islamic science. And so these three characteristics of al-Kindi's thought characterize the whole of Islamic peripatetic philosophy, namely, concern with the relationship between reason and revelation, as well as other specifically religious philosophical questions, the connection between philosophy and science, since they were all philosopher-scientists, and the connection between mathematics and music, since they were all musicians. Now we will turn to al-Kindi's successor, al-Farabi, the next great figure in the Masha'i school. Al-Farabi lived nearly a century after al-Kindi and was not his direct student. After al-Kindi, the province of Khorasan, where al-Farabi grew up, became the center of Islamic philosophy. Half Persian and half Turkish, he was brought up in a Persian ambiance. Even more than al-Kindi, al-Farabi should be considered the founder of Arabic philosophical vocabulary. It was al-Farabi who for the first time molded the language of the Quran to express philosophical discourse. Al-Kindi began the process, but with al-Farabi everything was set in place. For example, something as fundamental as the word for being, the foundation of all philosophy, al-Farabi coins as wujud, from the Arabic root to know, wajada. It's profound that in Arabic the words for being, knowledge, and ecstasy share the same root, a point which we'll return to in a later segment. What I want to say here is that the usage of these terms, which have now become everyday words in Arabic, in fact were being molded at that time in the Islamic world, and al-Farabi, even more than al-Kindi, is responsible for that molding. He was also a great musician and probably the greatest theoretician of music in the Islamic world, and he wrote 30 treatises on the subject of logic. Al-Farabi was a great commentator on Aristotle. The Muslims called al-Farabi the second teacher and Aristotle the first teacher. Aristotle was not called the first teacher by the Greeks. Why would the Muslims call Aristotle the first teacher and al-Farabi the second teacher? The Muslims considered the title teacher, mu'allim, not to mean only a person who gives instruction, but also a person who delineates and classifies various branches of knowledge. Aristotle was the first person to have done that in Greek thought. He classified the various forms of thinking, wrote books on logic, then distinguished logic from physics, physics from psychology, psychology from metaphysics, and so forth, setting the boundaries of the various sciences in ancient Greece. Al-Farabi did that for the Islamic world by integrating Islamic and pre-Islamic sciences. His book, The Enumeration of the Sciences, had a tremendous role to play in the curriculum of medieval Western universities. This concludes this segment on the founder of Islamic philosophy, al-Kindi, and the beginning of discussion of the next great figure in the Mashai school, al-Farabi. In our next segment, we'll conclude our discussion of al-Farabi.